Hello everybody, and thank you very much for coming. We're extremely pleased to welcome Irina Sandomirskaja, who is a professor of cultural studies at the Center for Baltic and East European Studies at Södetörn University, which has unpronounceable vowels in Sweden. And Irina has done extensive research in the history and theory of Soviet politics, the body, representation in everyday life, language, literature, film, and philosophy. And her overall interest is to develop a critical theory of the Soviet, especially the Stalinist period in Russian culture. And her current research concerns the reinvention of the USSR, of the Russian past, and tradition during the interwar period. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you really very much for having me here, for letting me enjoy this environment and this wonderful city, having a truly sabbatical for the first time in my life. I feel not only a true academic but also a good Jew, because I'm enjoying this Saturday by not initiating anything, or at least trying not to initiate, not to sparkle anything new, God forbid. And it feels really wonderful. So I just wonder what is going to initiate in me by itself as a result, thanks to this wonderful opportunity. And thank you for coming and listening. And I have lots of apologies to make for this presentation, because I have already been complaining to Bruce that I have a feeling that with this story, which doesn't let me go, it kind of haunts me like some kind of phantasmagoria, that I am caught in some kind of an open secret, secret de Polichinelle, that everybody seems to know everything about it. And I'm just discovering things every time I discover something really sensational. It turns out somebody has already written about it. So I just wonder what I'm doing and why this story doesn't let me go. And I'm also wondering if I will ever be able to cope, to get hold of it. So I really don't know. So I have a text to read. It's actually exactly 42 minutes when I was rehearsing it, but I have 3.5 extra pages that I can skip if it goes too slow. And then I have a little piece of film to show if I am lucky to find this point in YouTube, which I need, and maybe some pictures which are not necessary in this presentation, but they might be nice. So anyway, this is a very humble attempt at some kind of a likeness of a critical theory, because I was thinking, after having worked so much with image and word, I thought it was time to do a little bit of something about the object. And then I realized that the object is not what we used to think, something that is translatable into discourses and pictures. It's something entirely different. And since my previous research ended with some kind of image of Soviet subjectivity as deaf, blind, memoryless, and languageless, so I thought that was a perfect subjectivity to explore in relation to a physical object. An object that looks at you and sees you as someone who is blind, deaf, languageless, and memoryless. What kind of object is that produces such a subjectivity? So I'm afraid that object that I found is the Russian icon, and I hope people are not going to be angry about it, but anything is possible. So anyway, I'm reading it if you don't mind, but you can interrupt me at any moment. So, in this presentation, I would like to suggest some preliminary ideas concerning the work of imagination and desire in the conceptual basis of the Soviet theories and practices involved in the invention, conservation, maintenance, and promotion of the Russian past in the guise of Soviet cultural heritage. It is a matter of common knowledge that cultural heritage, as well as the ideologies of the past, have always been central in the construction of national identities and nation-states. More complicated, however, is the question of national legacy as part of the imperial project, given the potential conflict inherent in the very construction of the imperial as a supreme order that surpasses and negates the national. The question gets still more exciting when we try to identify the place of the Russian past within the imperial order of the Soviet Union, which eliminated the national by associating it with the remnants of the withering bourgeois order and repressed the national in the name of proletarian internationalism. Secondly, not only a national past, but also any past at all, became in the Soviet Union an object of manipulation and intervention by the symbolic regime with its characteristically extreme, truly futuristic historical nihilism. Paradoxically, it was exactly that Soviet nihilism, not nihilism, right? Nihilism, towards the past, that prepared, I'm not only Russified, but also Swedified, please. I apologize, that's why I didn't want to give this paper to you, because it's totally revealing. So, paradoxically, it was exactly that Soviet nihilism towards the past that prepared and carried out in practice the international promotion and acceptance of the artifacts representing the Russian past in an even more superior capacity of global legacy. It was entirely due to the Soviet scientific and diplomatic efforts that ancient Russian icons and churches that are nowadays on the UNESCO World Heritage List were constructed and accepted as objects of cultural heritage and not simply as loot, and as such delivered to the international museum audiences and the clientele of international auction houses. Thus, this gradually globalizing line of light from the Russian past via the Soviet legacy towards world cultural heritage is extremely interesting to follow, especially with a view to what kind of materialistic factors drove forward this drama of cultural idealism, strategies, technologies, economies, aesthetic tastes, and politics behind the manufacture and exchange of the objects in question in their capacity of aesthetic and historical artifacts and monuments of Russian culture of international significance. No other example would illustrate these moments better than that of the Russian Orthodox icon, as it was reappropriated in Soviet aesthetics, art history, and heritage politics, and especially with a view to its further international appropriations. I started approaching the issue by trying to establish the role of Soviet art restoration and art history in the international commodification of the icon and its further redefinition as world cultural heritage. The Russian icon in its capacity of a historical and aesthetic object is no longer a cult object or a religious relic, but a phantasmagoria in Walter Benjamin and Adorno's sense of the word. It is an affective as well as a historical artifact, a market commodity and a cultural historical fetish at the same time. As a phantasmagoria, it is an object produced to blind and to dazzle, to seduce and to fascinate, a Wunschbild, a magic object designed, if one expresses this in Marxist terms, so as to produce an exchange value that would conceal its historical use value. In the production of such an object, historical knowledge and professional expertise play their roles alongside such powerful factors as political planning, economic interest, diplomacy, personal career ambitions, and the pleasures of collecting and connoisseurship. All these combine in aestheticization and commodification, giving the former church relic a new genealogy and a new truth, purged of its origins in a millennial cult and determined entirely by the logics of rehistoricization and reappropriation. As is well known, Russian icons were expropriated in the course of the Bolshevik campaigns against the church in 1918 and 1922. Appealing to the financial necessity of fighting famine, the authorities used organized violence and vandalism in the suppression of resistance and in the requisitions of church values. Russian icons only partly escaped destruction, mostly thanks to the art historians' efforts showing to the Bolsheviks the icon's potential value as museum artifacts and internationally marketable commodity. This value didn't exist at that time, so it was totally invented on the spur of the moment. During the Civil War, with a mandate from the Commissariat of Enlightenment, groups of art historians and conservators received unprecedented possibilities of studying and describing monuments of Russian medieval art, especially in the Moscow Kremlin and in the surroundings of Vladimir. It was also at that time that the Soviet art historical discourse started to be constructed, which included the former church property into its canon, but in such a way as to delete completely church history from the narrative. This is how, in the aestheticized and re-ideologized, re-historicized form, under the title of Russian medieval art, the objects of cult gradually entered the historical doctrine and iconology of socialist realism. The reduction in which these objects also reached the Western art markets and museums and eventually took a place of honor in international art collections in the capacity of highly valuable collectibles and cultural heritage of world significance. So what we are watching, what we are looking at the museum, seeing a Russian medieval icon in front of us is basically a monument of socialist realism. Really, more or less. I'm specifically interested in these practices and discourses of rehistoricization, aestheticization, domestic heritage maintenance, and international exchange during the formative years, the 1920s, 40s, to understand how the innovative political and social uses were applied to such archaic, ideologically alien, and highly effective objects as icons. What kind of efforts and techniques were required to domesticate the historical memory incorporated in the relic? What politics and technologies of knowledge helped utilize them for the purposes of commerce and propaganda abroad, and for the education of the masses at home? This case is quite outstanding given the dramatic contradiction between the conservative character of heritage, aesthetics, and ideologies in general, especially in what concerns Russian Orthodox Church relics, the ultra-conservative of the ultra-conservative, so to speak, and on the other hand, in this particular case, the futuristic strategies of heritage maintenance and museumification as those were invented in the USSR during that period. Throughout that relatively short time, the Russian icon made several about-face turns, transforming from a holy relic into an object of traditional peasant handicraft, in which capacity icons were sold in American department stores in the early 1920s. Then they turned into objects of high art, to be displayed in the most prestigious museums, as for instance the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Arts during the 1930s. Then, from a symbol of counter-revolution in Russia, they were transformed into a means of propaganda for the benefit of the Soviet regime that had suppressed it. From a holy image into a commercial commodity, an instrument of cultural diplomacy, and ultimately an international representation of the Soviet symbolic order itself and its cultural politics, as we can find in the UNESCO brochures from the 1970s. The exploitation of the icon and such functions was initially made possible when the sacred image was subject to re-evaluation in the spirit of Russian modernism during the Silver Age. So there's a very important thing here, that this re-evaluation of a church relic into an artwork did not happen under the Bolshevik. Just like the change of the old Russian writing system was not performed by the Bolsheviks, but it had been conceptualized long before that by Social Democrats, and then only introduced by the Bolsheviks by special decree. So something like that also happened with the icon, even though among the people who were re-evaluating the icon, there wasn't a single Social Democrat. They were all very much to the right, very much so. Trudoviki and Narodovolцы was the extreme left of that group of people, which was also problematic in future for those who stayed in Russia, in the Soviet Union. So that's important, that the Bolshevik didn't invent it, but they used it in a very interesting way. And so after the Silver Age, once again, another reevaluation, or even better to say, a number of different reevaluations in the spirit of socialist realism, as a result of which the icon's religious significance was suppressed by its aesthetic and political users, and thereby even more exposed for further exploitation. As one observes, for instance, in the current situation in Russia, when icons seem to reappropriate again their ecclesiastic identity, and at the same time their falsification flourishes, nowadays no longer concealed by any decorum. The central figure facilitating such vertiginous transformations under the Soviets was Igor Emanuilovich Grabar, born 1871, died 1960, a highly placed Soviet cultural bureaucrat, the founder of the Soviet heritage management system, a modernist art historian and artist, later on a Soviet academician, one of the fathers of the Soviet version of the Russian art history, and also one of the generalissimi in the Stalinist cultural establishment. Under the Bolsheviks, he became the chief figure in Soviet museum organization, an authority in artistic restoration, often suspected of falsification, but never proved, and an important agent in Stalin's cultural diplomacy. His extremely intricate personal history under the Bolsheviks, together with the history and implications of his activities as the director of the Tretyakov Gallery and the head of the Central Art Restoration Workshops in Moscow until 1934, where all those details, all those intricacies were carefully edited out of the Soviet editions of his voluminous art historical work and biographical documents, as well as from many art show catalogs that represent Grabar's painting as proof of an uninterrupted, truly Russian tradition and aesthetic permanence. I have some pictures, I just don't want to interrupt because I'm sure the technique wouldn't work. So we'll leave it for afterwards if we have time. But you'll see, it's all Russian, all traditional, all permanence, nothing revolutionary. Nowadays we learn more about the extremely dramatic circumstances under which the visibility of this non-interruption and permanence was created. As we get a better access to the secrets of Grabar's history as a passionate art lover and collector, a smooth operator in the dangerous intersection between art, money, history, and politics. A man with a negotiable identity, a self-produced and rather vague genealogy, and a totally unidentifiable ethic. A man working towards the satisfaction of his private ambition as collector, connoisseur, and administrator, but at the same time bridging geopolitical and ideological divides while carefully avoiding the numerous landmines in institutional politics, negotiating between extreme idealism and extreme pragmatism, the academic educatedness of his Western counterparts, and the cruel greed of his Soviet patrons. A truly fascinating life crowned with an equally fascinating combination of fame and infamy. His is an outstanding case of agency, and not at all unique for his time and circumstances. Through the prism of Grabar's enterprise, I hope to understand how the cultural, political, and commercial appropriation transformed the Soviet landscape of memory and history, and how this affected the ongoing, profound crisis of historical consciousness in the present-day Russian society. This project also takes its roots in an attempt of questioning that very Soviet historical nihilism that I postulated just 5 minutes ago. The present-day historical studies in the Soviet policies and practices of cultural heritage almost exclusively concentrate on the facts of the destruction by the regime of the material legacy of the Russian national and imperial past. My interest, on the contrary, lies in the opposite direction. I want to concentrate on what the Bolsheviks and then the Stalinist regime and its heirs in the post-war USSR preserved, conserved, and cultivated. In the final analysis, what we nowadays know about Russian medieval art and architecture, we know exclusively in various Soviet redactions, as I already said, and to know the details of such redactions and the intricacies of struggles behind them would be extremely valuable for us if we want to understand the specifically Soviet or post-Soviet politics of history. One can make interesting conclusions from the study of discourses, but the research of objects and performances associated with these objects is only now starting at anthropology, museum studies, urban studies, design studies, and now even in the history and theory of restoration. I mean historical and art restoration. For a long time, the work of historical preservation and art restoration was taken for granted as a self-evident and necessary technical and applied discipline, an auxiliary service and one of museum technologies. Only recently have historians started writing the history of Soviet restoration, both biographies of its actors and institutions with their practices, and restoration experts started writing theories of restoration and conservation, thus breaking up with the traditional view of conservation as purely empirical auxiliary handicraft. Once again, however, the emphasis in the writing of such histories is quite understandably focused on the massive loss and destruction, sometimes even on the falsification of the past and speculation with its artifacts. Once again, my focus is not on what was disappeared, but on what was preserved, museumified, commodified, and promoted, and how and why and to what effect, and how what was allowed to stay entirely changed its identity and temporality, a peculiarly futuristic logic of history, when the past was monumentalized not for itself, but for the sake of the future, and the local became meaningful not as the local, but as a premonition of a universal, global, and even cosmic future to come. Those of you who ever traveled to the USSR during its late period would certainly recognize this future-oriented past and cosmically oriented localness in the tourist advertisements. In posters, invariably represented the USSR through a colorful montage of a monument to the conquerors of the outer space at VDNH with images of the Pokrov Church on the Nel in Vladimir region. A similar message could be also read out of the surroundings of the central tourist ghetto in Moscow, the now destroyed and once highly prestigious Hotel Rossiya, with its high-tech futurist architecture, surrounded by and beautifully contrasting with what remained of the old Zaryadye churches, most of them demolished in the process of the creation of the Zaryadye architectural complex in the 1960s, and just a few reconstructed or restored to create a historical opposition to the futuristic steel and glass of the Rossiya building. Another well-known example of this historical futurism is the former Kalininsky Prospect in Moscow, constructed to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution and boasting just one little church left from the whole of the old Moscow region of Arbat, destined to symbolize the Soviet technocratic approach to the past as merely a decorative detail on the high-tech image of the future. In Alexander Medvedkin's 1938 comedy, New Moscow, I have this piece also on YouTube, so I can show it, but I'm sure everybody has seen it, because it has been used as an argument in Slavic research so many times. It's like this piece is a classic, but we can have a look at it. I mean, it's really beautiful phantasmagoria. So 1938 comedy, New Moscow, Novaya Moskva. The characters build a living model of the city to celebrate the achievements of the new architecture and socialist city planning of Stalin's USSR. During the public demonstration of the installation, the living model starts rolling time backwards instead of pushing things forward. A fault in the apparatus creates a grotesque spectacle of modern architectural projects crumbling and disappearing, while Moscow's traditional cityscape, with its palaces, domes, and crosses, re-emerges from under the debris of the brave new world. Would you like to have a look now?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. We'll try. We'll try. We'll see what happens. I mean, we rehearsed, but who knows? It's here, I think. Yes. And now, I'm sorry, I couldn't exactly find that moment where I should start. So we shall start here. It might be an extra minute. I hope there is no sound, because the sound is really disgusting. This is really strange. to, no.
No, you have to press it.
Yeah, I have to get it first, yes, exactly. So anyway, he will be over in a second. This is almost the end of the film, this New Moscow, it's a comedy, and you will see how this model works. Right now, it's masses of Stalinist approvals on that page. Like that was the real Soviet people. I'm sorry, yes, it's just another 40 seconds. There is also a love story there. I don't even remember. It's so... This is very Medvedkin, by the way, with this little piglet in the box. Because Medvedkin is known for his fantastic work with animals, but not only. If I just could make it a little bit, but I cannot. I'm afraid to lose it completely. And in the meantime, you're forgetting why I wanted to show you this, right? Here, okay. So a little bit of probably documentary footage. Then these people are coming to see this living model. And there are too many people. And then the guy who is supposed to be the operator, he cannot get through. So here comes a little bit of humor, which we cannot miss because we are afraid to lose our footage completely. And here's people sitting inside, and that's the installation over there. And here's the guy who doesn't know how to operate it. And they simply have to start because the real operator is not there, but well, he says, I can try, what can I do? So he tries. And then it begins. And we can see from the very beginning that something is wrong, but we won't find out exactly what. Oh, this is wrong. Okay, so what's happening? At this moment, I will not turn on the sound, but at that moment, the public starts laughing hysterically. So it's all coming back, all of it. And the new buildings just disappear. And instead of them, old Moscow comes back, so everyone is laughing. And everyone is shouting like, get it right, you know. Yeah, get it right, no, it's wrong. Okay, that guy is, See? That's real phantasmagoria. It's really frightening. How things are getting back. And everybody is laughing, see? It's really, really funny. Then the real operator comes, and now it will be okay for the coming 15 minutes or something. That famous animation with, you know this thing. So anyway. So she will, this is by the way Nina Alisova, who's the genius of Protazanov, and so on. So then he turns the whole thing in the right direction, and then we don't have to worry anymore or be afraid anymore, because now the old things will disappear and the new things will grow out of the debris of the old things, see? And not the other way around, and so on. Now we have to know how to stop it, right? And now it will be playing over and over, and this is what I was trying to make it do the whole of the morning, to make a loop out of it. Okay, so in this comedy, yes, so a faulty apparatus, the old world re-emerging from the debris of the new world. Phantasms of retrieval, return, redemption, restoration, or remont, as Walter Benjamin would have called them, constitute the symbolic structure of a cultural monument. That is, an object that seeks to embody a dreamlike past to serve its living model. Any cultural monument is primarily a monument to survival, its memory being the sum total of carefully selected and administered oblivions. This negative conception of the monument seems to contradict the positive constructive theories of monumentalization, and I mean any historical monument. I mean monument as monument, but also an artwork, which is also a historical monument, when it's in the museum, for instance. So I mean monument in really wide, broad sense. The positive and constructive theories of monumentalization, those that are based on the idea of preserving and increasing the nation's or even the whole of the humanity's cultural capital. In cultural heritage talk, this is understood literally. I mean, cultural capital, it's really understood literally as cultural riches, культурное богатство, cultural treasures, сокровища культуры, as the nation's spiritual legacy and inheritance, духовное наследие, as opposed to spiritual impoverishment, loss, disinheriting, and stripping of cultural rights. The positive cultural and beneficial role of cultural monument is then seen as the implementation of the special faculty of the modern cultured subject to seek riches in art and history, and not in the satisfaction of biological primeval urges. Where a primitive man is driven by hunger and sexual urges, the civilized cultured subject seeks to follow a specific volition towards art and culture. Kunstwollen or Kulturwillen, as the old German Geistwissenschaft called these, or Kulturnis, to use the notion of the early Soviet Kulturträger. These are all approaches that make the concept of culture itself highly problematic, facilitating, as Walter Benjamin wrote, the disintegration of culture into goods, which become objects of possession for mankind. And then he says they enlarge this approach to culture as goods, as riches. They enlarge the weight of the treasure that accumulates on the back of humanity. So it's heavy for the humanity to carry those treasures. This produces cultural objects as phantasmagorias, to use another of Benjamin's concept. That is an object that denies the fact that it is produced and consumed as a commodity. To demystify a phantasmagoria, one has to become aware of the process of its production, both in which it originates and in which it survives. Until then, culture will remain reified, and not only in a capitalist economy, Benjamin continues, which is based on the commodity, but also in the socialist education efforts in the communist enlightenment of the masses. So you have this phantasmagoria, not necessarily found in the capitalist economy. It can be also implied in the socialist effort. And I think the whole of this work of reformatting the icon and old Russian culture was exactly the result of this socialist education effort, which increased the heaviness of the burden for the humanity to carry, according to Benjamin. The past seems to have haunted the Bolsheviks' futurism as well as Stalinist modernization, just like it haunts modernity at large. And in Medvedkin's quite weird, if not macabre comedy, history makes a truly ghostly appearance ex machina. Predictably, his attempt to make a joke out of a past that threatens to come back totally misfired. Instead, it revealed the presence of a melancholic narcissism and obsession underlying the historical and nihilist Soviet symbolic order. It intimated further on the horror of a past that can be retrieved technologically. In Medvedkin's double illusionist nightmare, historical technology fails, as the result of which the phantasmagoric past gets out of control and destroys the utopian future. A scenario of dream work which is recognizable for those who follow in the media the present-day return to the USSR of Putin's Russia, and especially in the catastrophic events of the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine, in the preparation in which both Kunstwollen and Kulturwillen were mobilized and even weaponized, thus reminding us in a very unambiguous fashion about the origin of the idea itself of cultural riches, in the deeply negative and disturbing context of war, violence, destruction, trauma, loot, marodörship, this kind of stuff. Medvedkin's apparatus goes amok, thus making visible the symbolic violence in the act of the object's resurrection in its new capacity of a cultural monument. As already Alois Riegel insisted, an object of cultural heritage does not coincide with itself. It is, to a certain extent, even a negation of itself, a product of fetishization rather than a neutral representation of the past, an object of historical fantasizing, a narcissistic Kunstwolle, rather than an authentic token of its own historical context. It has its own grounds in technologies of restoration, conservation, museumification, display, and so on, and in the aesthetic preferences of the collector, rather than in the terms of its own production as a genuine historical object. It circulates as a commodity and generates exchange value, even if it is invaluable, or maybe just because it is invaluable. So I have just 3 pages about phantasmagoria and melancholia, if you are interested, but this is something that everybody knows. I can easily skip them, but they're really beautiful. Okay. So Sigmund Freud, really great old man, was not only a contemporary of the birth of the concept of cultural heritage out of the spirit of Kunstwolle. With his studies of hysteria, he also produced a number of analytical concepts that are indispensable in the critical understanding of cultural heritage as ideology, taste, and practice. Thus, for example, he used an illustration precisely from urban architecture and urban preservation to illustrate the phantasmagoricity of the idea itself of preservation and keeping in place. In Civilization and its Discontents, he starts by asking his reader to imagine what the city of Rome would look like nowadays if not a single building of it would have ever disappeared, if everything were preserved, ever erected there, just like here, throughout the millennia of Rome's history. Preservation, Freud continues, is a fantasy to compensate for the horror of loss, the horror of vacuum that is the constituent fear underlying the modern subject's sense of the past and his search for historicity. The second analytical concept in Freud that seeks to directly explain the importance of historical artifacts, such as cultural monuments, has already been discussed in detail by Hal Foster in the interpretation of Freud's notion of modern man as a prosthetic god. A prosthesis, as you remember, of course it's a classic, enhances the faculties of man, especially when the natural organs responsible for the faculties in question are lost. However, alongside the filling up of the gaping empty space left by amputation, the prosthesis also serves as a permanent reminder of the fact of the amputation as such. By extending capacities, the prosthesis also incapacitates. It enables the functioning of the body and at the same time immortalizes and monumentalizes the initial loss. It adds and subtracts by the same token, enhances and diminishes by means of enhancement. The negativity implemented in the structure of the prosthesis becomes especially challenging when the futurist prosthetic thought is turned backwards into prostheticization of the amputated past that is, as Foster says, deader than dead. This is actually the point in the modern quest for history and the cultural monument. For instance, a historical piece of art hanging in a museum, and it serves the prosthetic function in the re-engineering of a better, more operative past instead of the amputated origin that is deader than dead. And still another of Freud's discoveries that have relevance in relation to the issues of cultural heritage is the discovery of a narcissistic mode of experiencing a past trauma in the mode of melancholia. There, again, as we know, the past returns again and again without a resolution of the circular temporality, giving the same pain every time it comes back, and locking the time of the subject into a circularity of repetitions of one and the same catastrophe. The melancholic mode of experiencing the past is deeply narcissistic, since in melancholia, grief is redirected from mourning about the loss of the other onto the suffering of the self, suffering the loss. Riegel's Kunstwolle, the phenomenon of collective modern imagination that he used to explain the modern cult of monuments and monumentalization, has a similar self-centered narcissistic structure. By monumentalizing an event and cultivating a historical object as a cultural monument, we do not celebrate the event as such, nor do we celebrate the historical reality of the object in question. On the contrary, monumentalization celebrates us, moderns, as subjects capable of making sense of and celebrating the past. The monument monumentalizes not the past reality, but the present day's ambition to include the past smoothly and seamlessly into the reality of the present, as well as the power of the artistic and cultural will of the present to select and revitalize the dead realities of the past, to give the dead past selectively a new life, and technically, aesthetically, politically, intellectually, and even historically superior contemporary reality. Not only Russian, but as I discovered quite recently, but also international conservation research and practice are filled with metaphors of melancholy. The central notion of conservation and restoration is loss. The object of its study and manipulation is the material token of all melancholy in the world, the ruin. Its operation is institutionalized by the central figure of melancholia, that of return, its reconstruction, restoration, reclaiming, regaining, resurrection, and so on. However, there is a special fixation that appears to me to be a specifically Soviet one, and this is the Soviet restoration's fixation on the origin, the original and the originary, the archaea, which figures so heavily in this Russian cultural heritage talk. I'm sorry I cannot give you a full lexicon, I actually collected it. Now I cannot find the file, so I will have to do it again. Precisely those expressions, linguistic expressions, metaphors of loss, melancholy, and beginning. Arche, первоначальное, изначальное. So, this fixation with the arche, that is the origin, not simply as a beginning, but also as the center of power. This is important. Proclaiming its purposes, the cultural heritage industry, from museum experts to local history enthusiasts like краеведы, appeal to the importance of the arche, the initiation of the beginning, of everything that is первоначально and изначально. They speak about восстановление or even воссоздание, reconstruction, restoration, recreation, resurrection, of the первоначальный вид, the original look, первоначальное состояние, the original condition, or even, and this is really absurd, первоначального впечатления, original impression, original perception, so they can reconstruct even this, of the object. Given the imperative of returning, regaining, reclaiming, restoring, reconstructing, etc., the origin, or the arche, it is imagined as something absolutely essential to the object, something that it is necessary to get back, and at the same time as something that is eternally and irretrievably lost, this arche. Art restoration and historical preservation thus use the rhetoric of posterity and permanence out of the necessity of dealing with decay and catastrophe on a daily routine basis. Indeed, I do not know any other trade that would be so intimately and fully incorporating catastrophic imagination into its empiricism, into the operations and techniques of its handicraft, in its techniques and technologies. From the point of view of this inherent catastrophism, preservation and restoration are probably the most complete realizations of modernity and the most faithful representations of modern subjectivity, with its disruption of experience, its knowledge by perception and tactility, and its reality of a history all made of shocks. Precisely as Walter Benjamin described the modern subjectivity in his study of Baudelaire during the Second Empire, which period, by the way, incidentally was exactly the time when conservation, restoration, and private art collection became the new religions of the aestheticizing progressive European bourgeois, as we get to know him in the worlds of Proust, Viollet-le-Duc, or John Ruskin. Interrupted historical experience, catastrophe, destruction, and the regaining of an object in an immediate tactile perception, here and now, are also the presuppositions in any project of restoring, reconstruction, preserving, or conserving the past. So it's not about knowing things, not at all. Besides, alongside the loss of the original within the object itself, within the object itself needs to be regained. The object of the past is eternally in the danger of being lost, either in demolitions, natural disasters, or political expropriations. An object of the past invariably represents a specimen of an endangered, if not already extinct species. I mean, also from the language of the professional talk. It is always already in the need of salvation. Within the walls of a museum or in a private collection, this object finds an asylum for itself. The fact that as a result the object finds itself also completely isolated and alienated from its natural environment is believed to be a negligible price to pay for the miracle of its survival, precisely like disabled children with disabilities. They have to accept the conditions of their pedagogics and schooling because the alternative is just total demise. It's exactly like that with museum artifacts. Absolutely. If we hadn't saved them, they would have disappeared. Yes. In this peculiar rhetoric of cultural imperialism, that the cultivated modern subject with his Kunstwollen and Kulturwillen should thank for the existence of such monster monument asylums as the British Museum or the Pergamon Museum, this rhetoric of salvation, as well as the imperial technological advances that allowed the transportation of whole ancient cities from the Middle East to and around European and North American museums. In the case of the Russian icon on the art market and in the museum expositions, the narrative about saving the object receives truly epic and tragic dimensions. In the situation of the Bolsheviks' extreme violence in the expropriation of church values during the early 1920s, the questions of museumification, which in fact amounted to acts of intended profanation of relics, but for the sake of saving this relic from imminent destruction. So this question was invented and debated passionately, promoted by the enlightened commissars like Grabar, accepted by the progressive clergy like Pavel Florensky, and absolutely rejected and condemned by the essentialist religious fundamentalists like Ivan of Kronstadt. Only the perceptive and ever-skeptical Malevich guessed the more fundamental driving force and the more general trend of modernizing aestheticization behind this archaic rhetoric of saving, protecting, and preserving. Malevich, as we remember, was suspicious about art as a stimulus towards the fetishization and commodification of reality, even under socialism. He called this exploitative symbolic regime харчевой социализм, харчевое искусство, that is, socialism and art reduced to a useful function in exchange for harch, for material remuneration. The icon had to be transformed into an aesthetic object, Malevich says, and by doing that, to be given a useful function as an artwork, if the icon wanted to survive, not as a symbolic reality, but merely as a material one. So aestheticization was more important than this saving thing. Apart from the fantasies of salvation, cultural heritage industry is also driven by those of redemption, which, apart from the ideological connotations on a very concrete level, implies the patching up of what was once destroyed or damaged, the regaining by a fragmented and disseminated universe of an original wholeness. It is exactly this redemptive gesture of gluing together shattered vessels into a new whole that explains the techniques of art and art historical restorations. It is peculiar how theological connotations are, in this case, implemented directly in the techniques and technologies of the restorer's work. The redemption of a holy image in the form of an aesthetic image, as for instance in the case of an icon in a museum collection, is of course not any redemption in the theological sense of the word, as has become evident in so many scandals, when the Russian Church nowadays reclaims icons as cult objects for cult purposes against the ferocious resistance of museums that hold and preserve them in their capacity of invaluable art objects. However, fantasies of redemption do not only arise from the museum's rhetorical devices, but are also inherent in the activity of collecting as such. Walter Benjamin, again a profound connoisseur of the trade of connoisseurship and collection, once postulated the passion of the collector and the rationale of collecting as a very special mode of dealing with the past and the beautiful in the fantasies of completeness. While a museum display wants to be representative of a style or an epoch, for example, the collection wants to be complete. Hence, the astronomical amounts of apparently similar artifacts represented in some collections, for instance, in Edward Fuchs' collections of caricatures and pornography. Hence, also, the evil passions of collectors in the wonderful novel by Konstantin Vaganov, an amazingly perceptive novel which is called Garpagoniana. It doesn't matter for a real collector, who is the main character, all main characters are collectors in that novel. It doesn't matter for a real collector what kind of objects he wants to collect. Even more, the weirder the object, the more passionate its collector, the more valuable the collection itself. Vaginov's characters collect and classify paired off nails, graffiti in public toilets, and virgin maidens' dreams, obsessed by the uniqueness and absurdity of their object of choice, and especially by the desire of an absolute completeness of their classifications. There is a religious, redemptive undertone in their dirty dealings, a feeling that completing their collection to a whole, the collector contributes religiously to the cause of collecting and redeeming God's creation out of its accursed share, out of dissemination and exile. And just to finish it up, even though it's a discourse that's very difficult to finish up, but still, to finish it up, 2 pages left, I would like to return to the initial idea suggested by the Russian language, in which political reaction and historical conservation are denoted with one and the same word, restavratsiya. If Walter Benjamin knew Russian better than he did during his journey to Moscow 1926-27, he would have noted this pun, this play of words. But he discovered a similar play of words in the word remont that puzzled him a lot, because in the French original, remont means the changing of horses killed in the battle for fresh new horses. In Moscow, Benjamin realized remont meant something that constituted an infernal parody of what Benjamin had come to study in the USSR, the reality of the revolution and the political proof, the historical proof of the possibility of a revolutionary redemption of history. Remont, the re-erection, reinforcement, and repainting of already defunct structures, was in Benjamin's eyes a faithful expression of what he saw going on around him politically. The restoration of the empire, the re-imperialization of the outskirt, and the cruel parody of the religious idea of redemption as the return from dissemination, as the reunion and the establishment of the final justice. In previous research of the Soviet sales of Russian artwork in the West, people like Grabach appear as careerists, using the talk of restoration and return as empty rhetoric to cover up the greed and injustice and even the crime of history's greatest heist. That is the expropriation of property by the Bolsheviks. Grabach and the like of him were indeed like that, but rhetoric, on the contrary, as we all know, is never empty. Soviet remont, or the restoration by Stalin of the Russian Empire, did have a redemptive aesthetic imagination underlying it, mobilized and weaponized by the regime in a manner comparable to the present-day weaponization of the Russian language and culture in the campaign of the return to the USSR. How many quotation marks I have to use in this previous sentence, I cannot even count, but you understand. At the same time, Benjamin's remont was a process not simply of political reaction on behalf of the empire, not simply a return of empire as counter-revolution, but also, as Lenin had put it, that of organization, a shock worker campaign for the construction of entirely innovative technologies of power in the form of Soviet institution, symbolic practices, and subjectivities. The political subjectivity that evolved as a result of such restorative, redemptive remont becomes more understandable if we consider the Soviet subject from the point of view of a phantasmagoric historical object, that is, as if seen by the eyes of a phantasmagorical historical object. The phantasmagoria as an object is especially interesting in precisely this aspect. When a phantasmagoria looks at its subject, what exactly is it that she sees? How does the object constitute, produce, and perform by the gaze directed at the human being, constitute, produces, and performs subjectivity? In quite a different context, in a previous study, I described such a subjectivity as determined by blindness, deafness, muteness, and memorylessness. A phantasmagoric object projects itself onto a phantasmagoric subject, and in its gaze, the subject loses sight, hearing, speech, and memory, all of its perceptive capacities, including the faculties of language and memory. This prostheticizing is the function of the institutions created in the course of the Soviet Cultural Revolution, including the institutions of the aesthetically valuable and historically meaningful, usable past. The icon's commercial success and its international museumification was just a byproduct of this prostheticizing of the Soviet modern subject, with its constitutive memoryless and languagelessness, deaf-blindness. Now, after the ultimate collapse of this Soviet modern subjectivity, ironically, it is only in Western museum collections that we can contemplate the Russian icon as the witness and the document of the modern Soviet memoryless and languageless deaf-blindness. Thank you. If you want to have a look at those, a couple of Grabar pictures, because I know the best thing is just to Google Grabar and go into images, and then it comes out as a carpet, as just a kingdom of light and color. But as many times as I tried to find, I never found a single reproduction on the internet of his official socialist realist painting, because he was an academician of Art Academy. He was sitting in all kinds of juries and, selecting paintings and artworks for really, really, really important, really ideological exhibitions. And every time such an exhibition was being planned, he knew that he has to produce a huge canvas with ideological content, because he will be awarded some medal or some title. It was already known beforehand. So in his letters, he describes those pictures, but I have never managed to see a single copy of them. Obviously, because now he is cultivated precisely as this very Russian, very traditional, very consecutive, very permanent kind of artist, like embodiment of Russian aesthetic, nationalist tradition, whatever that is. Okay, go away, please go away. Okay, what do we have here? Where do we go? Yes, we go here. Exactly. And I just show you, so that's him. And this is the kind of portraits he produced all his life. It never changed. Socialist realism, not socialist realism, post-socialist realism, before Stalin, under Stalin, after Stalin. It was the same. I love this next picture, because this is him. Look how many, I think Plato would be happy. Yeah, reflections of reflections of reflections of reflections, en masse. Then I found a lovely detail of that permanence of his, because this is a fragment of a still life from 1904, I think, and this is the fragment of a still life from 1939, and he still has the same teapot. I mean, think about the years, think about the historical events that the country has gone through. He still has this Meissen teapot, pot 39, and maybe he had it the whole of his life. And of course, this thing, which is recognizable to everybody, I was really, really genuinely shocked when quite late in my life I realized that it was not a work of socialist realism. It was it was also from 1904. It's an image that you could find in any textbook ever. School textbook, like throughout the whole of the Soviet period. Whatever happened, this picture was always there. I think that's all. You know what? According to a legend, this is an image that saved his life, but this is a legend, of course. That's a portrait of a girl named Svetlana, and so the legend says it's Stalin's daughter. It's Svetlana, the future Svetlana Amelueva. So I like those Russian myths, when they find such an arche, you know, a beginning, the origin of everything in just one picture. So it's known as exactly something that, while all his colleagues were being imprisoned, killed, all of them, as nationalists, as Russian fascists, in many capacities. He never suffered. In 1937, he even published his autobiography that's that big, that thick, color plates, publisher House Academia, and it's his autobiography, and it's so scandalous in 1937 because he's writing about Silver Age with much sympathy. So the publishers have to make a little note saying that we don't agree with what he says about the Silver Age. But they still publish it, and it's a deluxe edition, and he's lying about himself like through the teeth. And it's of course wonderful reading specifically those Soviet editions and trying to identify what kind of things he's evading just by knowing the Soviet rules of the plain language. So yeah, not so interesting, but Grabari is a special subject. I got totally fascinated by him, and I just don't want to go into it right now because it's morbid. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful talk. We have time for questions.
Yes,
so
thank you for listening. Yes.
Well, I'm really interested in the idea that the reappropriation conceals the use of the icons within church history while creating a new narrative. I'd love you to expand on that, but also to say it's not just the use of the icon in church history. I assume it also conceals a previous narrative. So it might be useful to sort of to get a handle on what that meant concretely, to think about what the previous narrative was, and how this new narrative takes its place.
Yeah, that's a great question, because of course the previous narrative is the narrative of the church.
Yeah.
It's the narrative of a holy image with all those, you know, details and intricacies of an Russian Orthodox cult, and the whole of this discussion about the icon. Iconoclasm or whatever there was, you know, there was a really long history inside the history of the church, debating, you know, that came from Byzantium. And of course that's also a debate that started with St. Paul, of course, and the interpretations of St. Paul as this kind of bridge between the Old Testament with its total ban on image, and then the New Testament, which says you don't have to make a cult of the letter. Don't make a cult of the letter. And so it's a long and very interesting story, but as a non-church, as a lay object, the icon started to be understood much earlier than Grabari and the Bolsheviks, because the legend again says that even Goethe was interested in the last years of his life. He was like sending some kind of questions to Russia, to the officials in Russia, to ask them, what was that thing, that icon, that Russian icon? And they told them, no, we don't know, there is no such thing. So it didn't exist until it started to be an object of collection, mostly by the old believers. And there you can read a little bit of Lyskov, you know, the Запечатленный ангел, the stamped angel, or what's the word, stamped angel. Because that's a wonderful story dealing precisely with the question of the holiness of an image and the holiness of forfeiting a holy image and even violating the holy image for the sake of saving the original arche, the really holy image. So you have these mirrors and mirrors and mirrors and mirrors. It's a very interesting theological question. But it started being collected by people on a lay basis, just collected as collectors. And those were not very well...
This is pre-Soviet.
Oh yeah, that's 19th century, mid-19th century. All kind of new bourgeoisie that started cultivating the religious knowledge as matters of interior. Just like in Baudelaire. I mean, it was happening in Russia with all those mujiks in Sapagi. And it was happening precisely with the logic of the Second Empire in the Baudelaire book by Benjamin. Absolutely, they started creating interiors. Then, somewhere in the 80s, the icon became an object of academic research. It started to be studied as iconology and iconography. So they were doing that in universities. The famous Nikodim Kondakov, who is the author of a fundamental book about Russian icons, and who finished his huge work already after the revolution. He was part of the Prague Russian University, and there was a seminarium which is called Seminarium and Symposium Underkriganum, and they were doing the icon, and they were doing it as iconography. And then the generation of Grabar came, and those were Silver Age, like aestheticizers and symbolists, and they started looking for a new Russia. They started looking for a new ancient Russia, and they were trying to find a new ancient Russia that would be in medieval and Renaissance Italy. And this is how they created the myth of Andrei Rublev, about whom we still don't know who he was, if he ever existed, as a counterpart, a Russian response, a Russian Raphael, a Russian Fra Angelico, and they started exploring those wooden churches in the north, because they were looking for some kind of northern Italy there. And then they started doing the icon, but also because 1910, I think, Matisse came over, because Matisse had his huge collection of his painting, which was being collected by the Russian rich mujiks, and then he saw the icon, oh! And that was the modernist, post-impressionist establishment of the icon, again as iconology. So what Grabar did, and he was really a very, very clever man. He said, when you want to say something about the icon, if you want to attribute it, if you want to tell the difference between an original and a copy, a falsification, a real, never ever look at the drawing, at the picture itself. Look at the materials. Look at the wood, do the chemical analysis of the wood, look how many wood-eating those things that eat wood, look at those, do this kind of never ever, because you can falsify the image as many times as you can. Which was probably his way of getting rid of this competition in Prague, we don't know, because they didn't like each other. And they competed, the emigre scholars and the Grabar people competed with each other for who is going to represent the icon abroad. So just last week I was sitting at the archive of Metropolitan Museum reading letters of protest written by the members of the museum, and that means the sponsors. So not like friends, but the real sponsors. In protest, giving up their memberships in protest against an exhibition of Russian icon on loan from the Soviet government at the Metropolitan Museum, 1931. Protest saying we cannot accept that. This is loot. This is a regime that has destroyed religion. It's impossible to receive those relics from the hands of the regime, which destroyed the church itself, and so on and so forth. So, what other, then there were, even the Soviet one, like you have the history of, and the aesthetics, and the logic, and the genealogy of the icon, of the Russian icon. You have it complete with just one little element missing. And this element is exactly the fact that that it's a church object. It cannot be described apart from the history of the church. So the Soviet socialist realist tradition gradually developed this discourse, a history of a church object in which the church is totally absent, and so on.
Quite exactly to the same topic, because it is a fascinating topic.
Totally.
What about coding? How coding goes? Because it would be very interesting probably to do. I'm sure you thought about it many times.
I haven't thought about it, but people are asking me about coding all the time. And I don't know if I should go into it because that's another story. The thing is that Grabar, when he was establishing the Soviet establishment for the allowed reproduction of icon, and we don't know what he did with the icons. Did he reconstruct them, restore them, did he make them? We just don't know. So one of those guys who came after him and left a fantastic archive here in New York Public Library, an art historian and practical restorer himself and the Soviet immigrant, Teteretnikov. He's dead now, but I think he was totally obsessed by the desire to prove that Grabar was not doing anything else but faking everything, not just icons. Because icons was the cheapest ware that he was dealing with. Maybe not directly, he was not an art dealer, but he was behind the curtains all the time. So what he did, when they started the job of restoring icons, which was also an interesting thing to do, because restoring in Grabar's meaning, that was something that terrified every other restoration conservation expert who came from them, because they were just destroying things. They had a special technique which was called раскрытие, and this раскрытие, that meant they were just scraping things off layer after layer after layer after layer, and then what they got in the end, they said, see, this is the original layer. And then they started quarreling with each other about whether this really was original, or should he have scraped a little bit more, or should he have scraped a little bit less. And it was totally arbitrary. It was totally arbitrary. So what he did, he employed a couple of icon painters, real icon painters, I mean religious icon painters, believers, to do this work of I don't know what, but anyway to produce these artifacts. So Korin originally was a kind of self-educated icon painter. I don't remember, was it Grabar?
No, he wasn't. He was working in a sort of Baltic style.
Yeah, exactly. He was a
doing
handicraft, yes.
Handicraft
Yes.
kind of.
He was a
self-taught
handicraft
there.
kind of guy, because for a long time they were trying to produce an alibi for icons that everybody still remembered, that they were religious symbols and that had been taken from the church by applying horrible violence. Everybody remembered that. So at first when they were trying to, what shall we do with them? Okay, this is just popular handicraft. We'll propagate it as popular handicraft. So they started to be sold. I think it was Hammer's idea to get those icons here to America and to sell them in department stores. And quite a lot of American collections of icons have their beginning precisely in those icons that they bought in department stores as pieces like matryoshkas. That's what. So okay, Korin special thing. That guy Korin, I have seen his restorations of Italian painting in Arhangelsk. This is horrible what he did to those Italian paintings. This is just to look at them and cry, weep with blood. But he was an established authority, precisely because he was also this Russian guy, Russian guy. He had it in his ensemble. That's a special. There are incredible biographies there. I just don't want to go into it. Life stories that just spring out in every little opening are totally incredible. Totally incredible. Yes, Bruce.
I don't want to torture you then with more life stories. But I of all this material, one of the lines that so stood out to me was the notion of the icon as a monument of socialist realism, right? And so, but that also prompted me to kind of maybe extend the earlier question, which was just a sense of I know this hasn't going in different directions, but if you can comment on the kinds of scenarios in the icons, if there was a preference for certain, the little I know of Russian icons is just simply about a certain kind of shift from in the 16th or 17th century when you started to see scenes of groups in an icon so that we could show we were closer to God and so forth. Then to more of a 17th, 18th, 19th century kind of drift towards scenes of individuals and the kinds of things that were much closer to portraits that a bourgeois collector might want in their living rooms or noting in the 1800s. So even in that kind of primitive rendering of this kind of different trends, were there certain things nonetheless for all its arbitrariness that did get shopped around more than others?
Not only shopped around, but actually became perfectly kosher. But probably it was only in connection with medieval Russian painting and medieval Russian architecture that you got any possibility of discussing any religious matter at all. And that's why, of course, I mean, you would be also cultivating these discourses as some kind of outlets, some kind of openings into a different discussion. But speaking about this,
Oh, and did any of those themes overlap in your mind with the kind of classic themes of socialist realism? I mean, because that's not a connection.
Not directly. No, I have to think about it. Not directly, but in search of such overlapping subjects, I would take up a more mature discourse from more academic people, like Lazarev, for instance. The people who were already second generation, who were not inventing but rather solidifying this discourse already. Well, he started before the war, but he became the great Lazarev after the war, and what he wrote about the icon. So it was really interesting that you indeed had the possibility of being a little bit Russian Orthodox, as long as you were dealing with these things. The idea itself to look at the icon as a representation of the Soviet regime, at least, if not a representation of socialist realism, because with socialist realism we get into this very difficult area of thinking what socialist realism actually is. And I don't think we nowadays can really describe socialist realism iconographically. You know, that this narrative is socialist realist and this picture is socialist realist and this is not. Because it's much more complicated on the one hand. On the other hand, I start agreeing with Zhenya Dobrenko, who says that social realism, it's institutions first and foremost. It's not iconology. So in this sense, you have to be more materialistic, more Grabar-like, you know, looking at the wood rather than at the face. Then another thing, I believe on my part that socialist realism, and this is also something that Dobrenko implies when he says about institutionalization, needs to be looked for not in the creative part of production, but in reproduction, in editing, in censoring, in discussing in all kind of artistic councils, Hudsavety, all kind of commissions, and so on. Because those were really debates, really discussions, even though we can hardly imagine that any truth could evolve out of such discussions. But some kind of negotiation of norms did happen there, and some kind of consensus was also there. Why I started thinking about socialist realism now, that was when I first saw a volume which Grabar had edited already at the end of the war for Molotov, who was preparing for peace negotiation, or 46 it was maybe, peace negotiations with Germany. And that was supposed to be a conference with the Allies, and it was already not good between Stalin and the Allies, you know, and things like that. So they produced a volume which is called something like "Разрушение фашистские", blah blah blah, something like that. And you have masses of pictures of churches from Novgorod, from Pskov, from monasteries, and it's the same rhetoric all the time. What it was beautiful and glorious and harmonious and fantastic and whole, and now look at it, it's just a ruin. And you have it at every page, including ruins that don't even, there are no ruins left. Just earth, no ruins, but now there is an original look, this is the original look, and we know that this huge campaign of restoring Leningrad's palaces, suburban palaces, Novgorod, Pskov, which is still continuing, in Novgorod and Pskov, these are the most important historical narratives of belonging, not the war, not the suffering of the war, not the suffering of occupation, which was, by the way, quite long and with lots of cultural politics. Novgorod, Pskov, Riga, that was the northern gouvernement, and they did quite a lot of cultural injection, the Nazis and the local collaborators. So this is not what people recollect now when they talk to people and tell them about interviewers and tell them about their identity. They say that's the campaign of restoration of the churches. So it's interesting that in the context of this destruction, catastrophe, the origins, the arche, and the absolute necessity to restore things the way they should be, that any talk and any representation of a church became possible and legitimate. That's extremely interesting. I mean, the question itself of socialist realism and catastrophe, right? Social realism should not presuppose any catastrophism. It's positivist, it's agitation for happiness. It's all about light. Remember the history of that painting by Loktionov, which is called The Letter from the Front. This is a very well-known story, which was almost demolished by the critics for being too dark, for pessimistic, naturalistic, I don't know what, not like horrible, awful, until he just changed one detail. He painted a ray of light, and it became the classic of socialist realism, right? And still catastrophe is there. And that was so interesting for me, that this necessity of catastrophe, in this totally neutered, discursive and visual system, how did catastrophe come in? How did the reality of war, extermination, terror, famines, what kind of entrance for itself did it find? What kind of place, what kind of home in this totally sunny, positivist, stupidly smiling world with its humor? It's the church, it's the icon. And not as an object of church history, no way, but as thoroughly academically historicized, aestheticized, formalized.
And exactly on that note, if you remember, kind of bringing forward into like 70s, maybe even early 80s, if you remember this joke, which was kind of quite popular, this, young girl, pioneer, whatever, brings her grandmother from the village to Tretikov's gallery.
Yeah.
And the old lady, the babushka, goes around and putting the sign of the cross and kneeling, seeing Rublev or whatever other icons.
Praying,
in the
yes.
70s, that's kind of the sign how it started, way it started changing, because we're now kind of talking about perestroika and everything else. It started changing much earlier. Or always was that line with you, kind of somebody who would come to the, because every joke.
To the museum, yes. Somebody who
Every
comes to the
joke has
museum and
something.
starts praying. Yes. Yeah. Yes, whatever.
So, for me, connection between socialist
realism.
Yes, I'm going to forget how it's called. Socialist realism and icons. It's actually, I'm a little bit surprised that you did not mention word propaganda, because it was propaganda. Actually, icons, whatever spiritual it is, it was propaganda, religious propaganda. And why, from my point of view, why Bolsheviks decided to save it? They had to learn from it how to create new saints, how to create new martyrs, how to create new propaganda. It was, of course, they did not copy it, but they still, and Stalin with all these reference to Peter the Great, and
Alexander Nevsky.
Yes, Alexander Nevsky, and all this. So although
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point, and we can even date the beginning of this stuff. I mean, Alexander Nevsky and Peter the Great and everybody, they became Nahimov, they became icons, and Suvorov, they became icons 1943, right? So that was right after Stalingrad, that was right when they introduced this new military uniform, which was exactly like the pre-revolutionary one. That was exactly at the time when Stalin allowed worship, open churches, open synagogues, and I think we still can see in the Moscow synagogue, we can see this old huge text with prayer for the state, which allowed open service in the middle of the war. And so at the same time, not only that, but they also start creating these icons, precisely as circular icons, but they are icons. You know, about propaganda and about another thing, by the way, Bruce, about this thing of representing the Soviet regime. The icon or the medieval church representing nothing else than the Soviet regime. That was actually part of the rhetoric of that exhibition with Russian icons from the Soviet government, because it was not just members of different museums that protested vehemently, just in the same way as nowadays Russian immigrants protest against Gergiev and in Carnegie Hall, writing the same kind of letters and threatening in the same way to withdraw their donations. I see that. But that was not only that, because when the Soviets started parading the icons, and especially when they started selling icons, even though icons were not the biggest market, and I must say that what Grabari and his group actually produced, they created a market for the icon, which hadn't been a marketable commodity before that. So I'm just thinking about how American art historians in the 20s, in the 30s, created a market for Italian Renaissance. If you have a look at that museum in Boston, Isabella Gardner, the history of this collection is absolutely the history of the acceptance, the reception, and the commodification and the cultivation of Italian Renaissance in the United States, which involves an enormous amount of money. I mean, just look at the Metropolitan Museum. It's like a railway station of Renaissance. It was all very new. It was only created in the 20s. So what Grabar did, he created a similar thing. He created a market for the icon. It was much smaller, it was much cheaper, but it hadn't existed. And so how he was explaining to his bosses in Moscow, and then also to the publics here, like why should the Soviet government show this icon, this exhibition of church artifacts? Because there was a part in this exhibition, and that was a traveling exhibition. It came from Germany, from Victoria and Albert, then it came to Boston Art Museum, then it came to Metropolitan, and then it spread all over American Canada. It was all over during the 30s, hugely popular. So he, Grabar, he was very, very ingenious, really a genius. So he had a special department within the exposition, which was dedicated to the presentation of his and his workshop techniques and technologies in the restoration of the icons. So he was showing the technology, he was showing how they do it. And he was pointing out in his letters, maybe he was boasting and lying, I don't know, but I wouldn't, he said that that was what interested the public most of all. So the public came, the public discovered those fantastic images, like dazzling, yeah, blinding, beautiful images, out of which quite a number were not even originals. Because Grabar said, oh, the originals are so precious, they're so fragile. We make you an academic copy. That will be an academic copy. And then they tried to sell those academic copies because the exhibition itself was not for sale, otherwise they would get problems with the customs. So they started making attempts of selling not the originals, but those academic copies, just to get a little bit, at least some money. Didn't work. So people would come in, they would be dazzled, they would be totally like thrown out of any balance by the exoticism and beauty, and then they would come to this technical part. And they would be presented with contemporary, advanced, informed, very positive, very concrete, engineering-like, technologically perfect explanation of how these icons are brought back to life and how actually the Soviet regime is capable of taking care of those invaluable objects, much better than the church itself, that had been keeping those precious pictures in bad atmosphere, and nobody could see it, and nobody could enjoy it, and basically they were just locked up. And this is how greedy and horrible the Russian church was. And now look, now we have enlightenment. Now we have an enlightened regime. It understands the value of aesthetic and historical objects. Not only understands, but it invests knowledge, expertise, and look how nice it is. In this sense, it was propaganda, not the object itself. Not the object itself. So it was really, I mean, he could be lying, because all of that I have from his letters, and he was horrible, horrible, horrible. But maybe not. Yes.
I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the relationship, I mean, pre-propaganda, the relationship of icons to the Russian avant-garde, and maybe even pre-revolution, because that seems to be a kind of lurking...
you know, there is a book about it, not just one book about it, and if you reminds me, I mean, I have a huge, and I have even read quite a lot of it. That's why I'm telling you, this is my disappointment. Every time I invent something, someone has already done
But
research
that seems to be, that's like a ghost in the...
It's very interesting. This thing with the icon, I mean, it's not only Malevich who said, yeah? There was a story before that. And the story before that was like that 1913, the Russian Empire was celebrating 200 years of the Romanovs dynasty. And they were...
1930.
13.
From 1913.
13. Okay.
13. 13. So that was 200th anniversary, and everybody was preparing. And they planned, and that was a joint project by the more enlightened church and the university, people like Kundakov, who were doing this iconography. And as I told you, they were really, really reactionary, like Black 100. At least Stalin's government called them Black 100. Might be exaggerated, maybe not so much, we don't know. But on the other hand, they were really much to the right, much. So they decided to make a huge exhibition of icons together, just to celebrate. At the same time, Larionov, who did not agree, decided to make his own exhibition, and he made his own exhibition of icons, and it was also academic in a way, because he didn't only present the images, but he also tried to work to show like the method of production, how they made them. So he was interested in those canons, and you know, there's an icon painting, they have special trafaret there. So it's not like that, but you feel in things. So he showed them, he showed some materials and so on. So you had this icon during one and the same year, all of a sudden, on public displays. And that was already when those restorers had already started opening up things, you know, scratching. This is how they had opened up the Trinity. And this is how Rubrov's Troitsa, right? By scratching off. 1904, exposed it, showed up, they said, oh my God, this is Russian Italy, we've never seen it. Then in 1918, Grabar said they hadn't scraped it right. We have to do it. Well, anyway, so it wasn't just a total novelty, but it was a novelty because it was a public exposition, a kind of a claim of a narrative, of a historical narrative. But then at the same time, it immediately appeared in those two versions, in those two redactions. So you had this official academic church one, and you had this Larionov, which was futurist, or Rayonist, or Luchist, or whatever, and was obviously following Matisse, who again opened it up for everybody else and just wrote that he had just seen something totally incredible. Then there were interesting things because before the revolution, there were such interesting debates about what the icon actually is. Pavel Muratov, for instance, the one who wrote this wonderful book about the faces of Italy, a fantastic compilation about Italian art, which is still usable from 1910, I think. He insisted on speaking about and thinking about the icon as a purely aesthetic object. It's just a work of art for art's sake, nothing else. Then on the other hand, you had Florensky, and you had other people. You had a person like Tarabukin, who then became a very, very, very important art historian and art theorist. But he was, together with Florensky, describing the icon not at all as an aesthetic object, but entirely as a window into this higher symbolic reality. Then you had Kondakov and his students who were doing iconography, and then you had Grabar, who was kind of running between everybody else and publishing the history of Russian art, which actually had been produced by a whole group, but all of a sudden became known in the history as Grabar's history of art. One of the problems there. So they had been going, things had been going. Irina Shevelenko is writing a lot about it, about this appropriation or different appropriations of this medieval and Russian through the filter of different aesthetic modernisms, including this.
Yeah. So there's two things that especially interest me in all that. And one is that you're making the claim, which I'm kind of convinced by, that all of this talk of the Russians, of Tatlin being trained as an icon painter, Malievich's black square being hung in the icon corner, and all this kind of lurking icon Russian avant-garde stuff, you're making the claim that it comes into the Russian avant-garde via Paris, which I think is really like that it's actually Matisse that they're following as much as their own Russian traditions.
I have that feeling, yes, because that was the leftist thing.
Right, right. So that's really interesting. And the other thing that I find really interesting there is the kind of, one of the things I was thinking a lot about in your talk is, this mice and teapot, which is an object, which is a thing, which is very much, it's very thingly. And you're talking about architecture and film and models and all these other kinds of things which are not really things as discrete objects, but making the same kind of argument with these other kinds of registers. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the icon, in the way you're discussing it as both object and image, mm-hmm. as kind of both this thing that we look at and also this thing which is and represents and isn't a window onto some other world, even as it also might be. That is really striking, and it's kind of parallel to...
You know what, now that you're talking about it, I started wondering if it is the object or the image that produces this subjectivity.
Yeah. In New Moscow, what the clip you showed us, and I've been writing about the kind of the notion of models in the Soviet Union, so I've been looking at sort of the other side of that movie, but that model, both at the beginning of the movie and at the end of the movie, it's both an object on a table and it's an image. Mm-hmm. And the image starts as a painting, and in the clip that you show us, it's a movie. Mm-hmm. So this kind of, it is a kind of iconic thing.
It's a kind of, yes, exactly, but they insist still that it's a living model.
Right.
So they insist that it's some kind of a three-dimensional thing. It's not just, it's only that's why I call it double illusionism, because it looks like Medvedkin didn't have any other way, like he could do 3D animation, even though I don't understand why he could do that, because Vertov did 3D animation easily, and that was no problem. But maybe it was also a celebration of cinema of some kind. But this image, the cinematic image, is supposed to represent a three-dimensional physical thing. And but it's a very, very good question, because it kind of questions the whole of this Benjaminian thing about perception as tactility. Should we take tactility seriously, or should we take tactility as another metaphor for visuality and discourse? I would like to take it seriously, but I can see now, and thank you very much for pointing it out, that I kind of slip into visuality, discourse, yes, and interpretation, which I'm trying not to do, but maybe it's not possible to capture tactility. I would like to, but thank you, no, it didn't work.
Irina, I had a quick question about the Bolsheviks, and that is, in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, they were trying to figure out the value of lots of things,
Yes.
right? But it was confusing for them because they didn't
And
really
we're
want,
often mistaken.
and they were often mistaken. They didn't necessarily want to trust markets. So my question is, what arguments did the academicians and art historians find that were most compelling to the Bolsheviks? Did they just show them receipts? Like, this is how much you could get for this in Paris? Or did they have to try a series of arguments?
Yeah. Again, judging by that anecdotal episode, which of course Grabar says that's me who did it, and in that sick thing from 1937, this is a question that needs really serious research, and we have to read quite a lot of things in order to find out. But he immediately tells an anecdote about how he found out all by chance that in those appropriations and these expropriations, things are being destroyed, even though we know that he personally took part in those campaigns, in those acts. So it's not that he just came to hear about it. But all of a sudden he heard that really valuable museum, beautiful old things were destroyed. And so he tells a story how he first went to speak to Lunacharsky. Lunacharsky, like this enlightened guy, but Lunacharsky didn't have time. And probably he's telling this story just to be able to tell his reader that he could come in without writing himself in a book and waiting too long. And so he sent him to Kalinin, and Kalinin was a simple guy. And to Kalinin he just explained that, well, okay, if you take some silver thing, as a whole, it might be a little bit more expensive than if you melt it. So it might cost a ruble. You know, he's a peasant, right? So he's got common sense. This is how Grabar tells the story. It's all fiction, but it's kind of fiction that, you know, okay, maybe. So yeah, well, if you melt it, it's a ruble, but if you leave it as a samovar, it's 10 rubles. And this is what he says, how they convinced him. And of course, it's a story about how those Bolsheviks trusted him, and how Lenin was so important, and how he was so careful about, you know, kind of stuff from the 30s. But basically, this is exactly what needs quite a lot of research to find out how much those academics and aesthetes were actually pulling the leg of a Bolshevik commissar, explaining to a Bolshevik commissar that he would gain much more money if he preserved this little Cellini thing as a little Cellini thing instead of, yeah, on the one hand. On the other hand, we also know that there was a necessity in melting these things up and kind of picking up gems out, you know, all those horrible acts of vandalism and so on. Because, for instance, 1819, we know there was a blockade on the Baltic Sea. No one was allowed to come out, and there was no exchange, there was no way of selling anything, of buying anything, and the British were trying to stop this Bolshevik disease as soon as possible. And then there was a Swedish intervention, and there is a Swedish part of the story here, because there was a guy, a Swede, a Jewish Swedish millionaire, and a Bolshevik sympathizer, and an enormous amateur of arts, and a messianate, you know, this kind of figure. So he went to Lenin, and he established Lenin's first international bank. So he did manage, in spite of the blockade, to establish a national bank for the Bolshevik government. And what they did, there was a technique, a special commission for anonymization, and that means обезличивание of artworks and works of, like, treasures. Обезличивание, that means they did everything possible to take away any trace of provenance, any trace of ownership, any trace about any sign of the origin of the object, in order to be able to sell it. So this injection of Russian art and valuables that started coming as a flood to Europe and to America after 1922, after Apollo conference, when it became legal, it was all without any signs of previous life. all those things that now find their places already kind of washed up by legal deals. When they first came, they had absolutely no identity. They had no provenance. Completely unthinkable how they could be sold and bought by serious people. So the only explanation is that they did it at a huge discount. So what the Swedish guy did, they collected those golden things, those valuable, not valuable, nobody cared about that. Somehow managed to contraband them to Stockholm. In Stockholm they were melted and stamped with Stockholm's mint cabinet, this thing, you know. And then it was sold all over the world at 30% margin. So Sweden got 30% out of it, out of just agreeing to trade in very, 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 very bad gold at a huge percent. So in this sense, I understand that to convince them not to melt those Cellini figures, that might have taken quite a lot of art. Might have taken. But anyway, Grabar was one of the first who realized that he had to work with Bolsheviks. And he created this huge alibi for everybody who wanted to collaborate. And the opposition was very strong. And that was another reason for everybody around him to hate him. He had already been thoroughly hated, but then he became so hated. Because he invented this alibi. He said we can take part in the salvage, in the salvation of those objects. We can intervene in the process of violent expropriations, which are totally justified, of course. And we can save at least something. And then you have this rhetoric, like better safe and totally anonymized than in existence. Precisely the kind of rhetoric that I later on discovered in the treatment of the blind children, that they shouldn't be negotiating the conditions of their life. They should be thankful for their ability to have this life at all. Same. It's kind of hegemony. One of the conditions of hegemony. In disabled, in invalid children and ill children, sick children, and in artworks, it's the same kind of hegemony. This is also socialist realism.
Do we have more questions?
No.
Thank you so much.
Thank